I did it first.
You're the copycat.
Stop copying me. Stop copying me. Stop copying me.
Stop copying me.
Okay, stop copying me. Stop copying me!
At least I won't be unoriginal.
Why do we hate when people copy us? They say imitation is the sincerest form of flattery, but that's only half the quote. My name is Maya, and welcome back to another episode of Read the Care Tag, a fashion podcast. This podcast is about anything and everything fashion-related, for all of those who never grew out of playing dress-up, with a sprinkle of history, a dabble of pop culture, a healthy dollop of fashion obsession, and a pinch of philosophical questioning. I hope you enjoy the show. Now, this is going to be a very interesting episode. What makes someone a trendsetter? Who are the tastemakers and who are the followers? Why do we hate when people copy us but still seek out those similar to us? Today, we will be answering all of these and more. But first, what do we mean by fashion? The word fashion in English comes from the 12th century French word façon, meaning manner or way, specifically referring to the procedural manner of making something. Façon is still actually a modern French word today with the same meaning. Mode or moda, the word for fashion in many other languages, come from modus, the Latin word for manner, essentially meaning the same thing as façon. The etymology of these words emphasizes the importance of the process and the action-centered basis of clothing. I mean, at the end of the day, you can wear a simple poncho or wrap a sheet around yourself, but the façon, or the manner in which it is woven, assembled, colored, and draped, are what gives it fashion beyond its just utile purpose. In the first episode of this show, we talked about why we wear clothes. And clothing has been around for about as long as we have recorded human existence. But does that mean fashion was around? How did we get from rough hides bound together with strips of twine to the haute couture of the 21st century? Well, most historians agree that the modern concept of fashion arose in the mid-14th century and solidified its place in Western society during the 16th century into the Renaissance period. I think this is fair to say. I mean, the etymology of the word supports this flow, especially considering how many non-Latin language origin countries who began to have trade contact with Europe during this period have iterations of mode, moda, or fashion as their word for the same meaning. Even in Russian, moda means fashion and façon means the cut or the style of the garment. And Russian has a completely different alphabet. But does this mean that fashion was just invented in Europe in the 13 to 1600s and everybody else just copied them? Well, before we can answer that, we need to create a working definition of what we mean when we're discussing fashion. If fashion is just the manner of making, then obviously the answer is no. Everywhere in the world, people have come up with personal, regional, and cultural manners of making since humans first picked up stone tools. The fact that sewing implements like bone needles, woven fibers, and twisted threads are common across the earth is also not an example of a specific origin of making, since they are simple, logical tools that could be spontaneously created by any hominid with a large enough brain. But fashion is more than façon, right? A combination of manner and purpose, or a collective choice to choose to wear one thing rather than another? Maybe both. For the purpose of this discussion, my working definition of fashion is as follows. Fashion is an evolving manifestation of collective choice that both affects and reflects the present collective experience through a medium. You might wonder why I say medium rather than clothing. And while this podcast is more focused on clothing fashion, many other things are affected by their own flow and cycles of fashions. From baby names and gardening to fine and culinary arts to urban planning to technology, consumption, politics, home decor, and even managerial styles are subject to fashions. Now, I know that may seem a bit confusing, and hopefully it will make more sense as we continue. Perhaps an easier way to explain what fashion is by showing what it's not. We often use fashion and style interchangeably, but they are in fact quite different. A style is a combination of silhouette, construction, fabric, and details that exist and which thus can be used over time. Essentially, a multidimensional, self-referential aesthetic system produced and extended over time. Just like the last episode about goth subculture, the trademarks of goth fashion are pieces and frameworks of goth style. But the fashion itself evolved. We saw how the fashion within the subculture changed from the 80s to the 90s through to the 21st century. But the core essentials of the style remain integral, an evolving manifestation of collective choice that both affects and reflects the present collective experience through a medium. So my definition rests on these 3 points. It's the result of collective choice, whether conscious or subconscious. It simultaneously reflects the current social state while also modifying it. And it is in constant flux. So if we go back to our question, was fashion invented in Europe in the 13 to 1600s and everyone just copied them? Based on my definition, absolutely not. And in recent decades, scholars have begun to address the biases and contexts that form this opinion. First and foremost, the thing I bemoan the most when it comes to researching fashion history, the dearth of extant garments. Clothing from the high medieval period is already hard to find, much less anything earlier. And while grave goods, ice, and cave finds do hold incredible discoveries about the extent of skill existing at the time, it's extremely hard to paint a picture of fashion with just a few items. Second, and no less important, the lack of interest and lack of sources on civilizations outside of the West on the part of English-speaking scholars. But this certainly didn't mean that fashion didn't exist before. Evolution still existed before Darwin named it. Gravity still kept the planet spinning and apples falling even before Newton decided to write about it. And while there is a little pre-Renaissance record of fashion,
That we know of.
there still are sources pointing at a robust clothing-based culture. Pliny the Elder, a Roman scholar from the 1st century, detailed the fashion rules and faux pas in ring wearing, and Virgil from a century earlier dubbed Romans those who wear the toga race, togari gens togara, emphasizing the integral nature of dress to identity. Just because there wasn't an official theory of fashion didn't mean that there wasn't fashion. In medieval Japan, for example, one of the biggest compliments you could give someone was call them imamekashi. I hope I pronounced that right, meaning up to date. Tell me that's not some fashion girl behavior. In short, I tend towards the opinion that fashion has existed since people started wearing clothes. And it seems that modern academics are starting to lean in that direction as well. So now that we've established what fashion is, sort of, why does it happen? There is no original thought, right? So then how did we get from kirtles to skinny jeans? How did someone decide to do something new, and what made people choose to follow? Well, that's the question of the episode. Since the modern use of fashion mainly refers to clothing and aesthetics, we'll stick to that realm. But do remember that all of these concepts can apply to different fashions. Now, in our working definition, we included the concept of change. Fashion is always changing, but who is changing it? There are a couple dominant theories, so let's break those down. First, trickle-down theory. This theory is based on social stratification. Essentially, that the aristocratic classes come up with new and elaborate fashions to distinguish themselves as the elite. As lower classes begin to copy them, the elites then abandon the style in order to differentiate themselves from the commoners. Then the lower classes abandon those styles and the cycle restarts. This theory works pretty well to explain early fashions, but it does kind of hinge on the concept that all fashions come from the elites, and the elites have some sort of skill that makes them better at starting fashions. But for a long time, according to empirical evidence, this kind of held true. Large-scale fashions maintained this trend due to functional needs and financial means. For example, in 10th century Japan, ladies at the court would wear junito, meaning 12 layers, otherwise known as itsutsuguni karaginomo. This high-end period of noble attire was made up of kimono-like layers that made movement quite difficult. One of the innermost layers that performed the function of underwear was called kosode, directly meaning little sleeve. The Japanese peasantry of this period mainly wore a kimono-like garment also called kosode, which was barely different from the noble's underwear. Not only could the peasants not afford the quantity of the fabric for the multi-layer garment, but they also could not perform their manual labor in this physically limiting style. The name of kosode, meaning little sleeve, illustrates the cheaper nature of the garment because it has a smaller sleeve opening, which makes sense both as a bottom layer garment for the nobility in terms of bulk, but also in practicality for the laborers. What were they going to have, dragging sleeves? But what about later? Early modern society was transitioning from a more feudal style of society to one more centered around bustling cities. Previously, the lords and courtiers formed an elite class holding lands worked by peasants in an essentially serf-like position. But the new society emerging in the transition from the high medieval to early Renaissance period had a wealth of middling and commoner classes, which would include more wealthy, more educated merchants and craftsmen, as well as common laborers like servants, sailors, butchers, bakers, or launderers who might also have a measure of wealth in comparison to the peasantry. Many of these people were peasants just a few generations ago and were yearning to be perceived as higher class. And while the clothes make the man proverb was still about a century away from rising in popularity, as we saw in the Virgil quote, this concept was already well solidified. However, the nobility had no interest in letting these fresh upstarts into their club. Say it with me.
Sumptuary laws!
Now, sumptuary laws have come in and out of style for centuries, often with the same intention of quelling fashion-forward nouveau riche, or reinforcing morality concepts. But they really came to focus in Queen Elizabeth's 16th century England. Under her rule, sumptuary laws were attempted to be strictly regulated. Certain colors, trims, and fabrics were restricted to certain classes. But even this did not stop trends from spreading to all realms of both income and standing. The popular fashion at the time was known for being a colorful one. Meanwhile, the silhouette for the majority of the period was a very stiff bell or cylinder shape on the lower body with a flattened chest shape on top. The layers to create this kind of shape tended to be pretty similar across the classes, but kind of similar in the same way that vertebrate skeletons are similar. Like my cat skeleton and my skeleton have a lot of the same bones and equivalent pieces, and while I am almost as cute as my cat here, you'd be pretty hard-pressed to mix us up. So to give you an idea of how the trends manifested across the classes, I want to do a quick speed run through those layers so you can get an idea of what it would be like to get dressed as a lady in the Elizabethan period. Full disclosure, I did go through this briefly in the very first episode, but I wasn't doing any visuals at the time, and I thought it would be fun to sketch out every layer as I go and show you the side-by-sides. Obligatory, if you're listening on Spotify, make sure to also check out the podcast on YouTube to see everything I'm talking about, or follow the podcast on Instagram at ReadTheCareTag for the highlights. So, first off, we start with the smock, or shift. Basically, a simple linen undergarment that protects the outer layers from the dirt of the human body. This would tend to peek out at the neck or sleeve cuffs, so those parts would often be decorated with a bit of lace or embroidery. Next up, shapewear, aka the corset or pair of bodies, which is basically a tight bodice stiffened with reed or whalebone, and while the bearskin corset tight-lacing fantasy haunts us in our historical movie nightmares, corsets were not as extreme as you might think. First off, the corset would be necessary for courtwear or fancy occasions, but generally petticoat bodies would suffice. And those are basically a soft-core bodice with an attached petticoat skirt. The combination of smoothing the front upper body and cinching the waist with voluminous skirts achieved the fashionable silhouette sufficiently for housewear. Someone with a bigger bust might need a bit more support to achieve the fashionable shape, while a member of the itty-bitty titty committee could get away with a bit of boning in their gown. Next is the farthingale, the precursor to the crinoline, It was basically a cone-shaped hoop skirt that created the popular shape and went through some iterations throughout the period. In my sketch, I'll be doing a French wheel farthingale, which creates that flat shelf jutting out at the waist. Then, the essentially named bum roll, which was basically a long pillow to tie around the hips to exaggerate the contrast between the waist and the skirt. Now, we need some volume. Petticoats on petticoats on petticoats. These were essentially a mix between an under and overgarment in that they softened and enhanced the silhouette, but also were often intentionally shown through slits, bottom of skirts, and accordingly embellished with lace and trims. Next up, the kirtle, an A-line undergown which might be accessorized with a forepart and then finished with a gown. Now, the gown is not quite what we imagine of a dress. There were many variations, so I'll explain the main points in common. It is essentially a long vest with a large skirt portion that closes at the front waist while leaving the bottom part open. Finally, matching or contrasting sleeves would be sewn or laced onto the gown. The look could be accessorized with a partlet, which is like an optional top neck area bib thing that covers a low neckline and adds more lace and frills to the outfit. Kind of like those neck bib turtleneck things, to put in your shirt so you can look like you're wearing a turtleneck under your sweater. Am I sounding crazy, or do you know what I'm talking about? Anyways, this silhouette is not the most comfortable. And if you're a working lady, it would be practically impossible to maintain during any sort of labor. But this doesn't mean that commoners were prancing around in potato sacks and gray rags. Just because we aren't rich doesn't mean we don't want to have fun too, right? So instead, working women would wear a structured bodice, not quite as structured as a corset, and it would act as a 2-in-1 shapewear and actual top. This would create the desired flattened chest, and while upper classes could also wear bodices like this over their farthingales, theirs were more elaborate and laced in the back. In contrast, common people would have front-lacing bodices so that they could dress themselves and have more comfortable movement. In order to achieve the desired bell-shaped skirt, women who could not afford layers of petticoats and costly farthingales, but also needed the ease of movement that layers of skirts would inhibit, opted for bum rolls, which could be made from scraps, and would contribute to the fashionable shape by pushing top layers of skirts out and away from the legs. Long skirts were also risky business when it comes to walking outdoors and laboring. Don't forget that sidewalks didn't become a common thing until the 1700s, so imagine sharing the street with carriages, horseback riders, and jostling people. If you had to walk anywhere via common streets, you were at risk of getting your skirt caught. So across the board, common women would have slightly shorter skirts, often with double hems, in order to extend the life of the garment. Unfortunately, though, all the changes to the structure internally meant that externally, social status was obvious. If you saw two identical women walking down the street with dresses of the same materials, but one dressed in a front-laced bodice and a rounded top to her shortened bell-shaped skirt, you would know instantly who belonged to which class. So does this confirm trickle-down theory? Only the elite classes had that magic brain juice that gave birth to fashion trends and the poor plebeians could just copy? Just like wealthy aristocrats and haute couture fashion houses trickling their trend-setting fashions down to the department stores throughout the 20th century, right? Well, not quite. When we look at early modern history, we have to remember that social stratification was baked into every part of life. Even if you were an incredibly fashion-forward peasant who started a trend in your village or town, no elite would ever engage in that trend because why in the world would they want to appear lower class? And even if something did break through, the credit would certainly be stolen. On top of that, it's just hard to find evidence of that happening. Not because it didn't happen, but because no one wrote it down. Another way that lower class people were held in their social place was literacy. Not only are there incredibly few sources discussing lower classes at all, but fashion is the last thing to be discussed about them. Practically the only way that lower classes gained literacy at the time was through the church, at which point worldly pursuits like fashion were far beneath you. So not only could you not document the micro-trend you created in your community for posterity, but it was also unlikely to go beyond your circle. Most people didn't travel more than 10 miles beyond the walls of their home for their entire lives, and if they did, it was usually for religious pilgrimage, so again, worldly pleasures are not really the priority there. On top of that, up until pretty much the mid-20th century, clothing was your best method of conveying your status and would strongly influence how you would be treated in society. So in a universe based on class and social capital, why in the world would anyone want to look poor? But this social stratification and how we communicate with our clothes has changed a lot since then. And as we've discussed before, history is not an orderly chapter book, with nice endings and beginnings to each chapter. The people who lived at those times had no idea that we would separate them into different periods just decades apart. And we're probably not too occupied with what people 1,000 years later would think about them. Just like today, most of us are focused on paying our bills and trying to be happy, not worrying about leaving clues for future civilizations. So it's important to remember that modern ideas of social strata are not applicable to pre-industrial England. And while we may end up using similar terms like lower, middle, and elite classes, we have to remember that the modern meanings of those words aren't the same. Almost all of these people would be striving to abide by the trends of the time and climb up a rung or two of the social ladder. But most of all, the emerging middle class is what I think precipitated into the series of events that tied the past to today's present. In 1440, the Gutenberg press was invented. In Europe, before this point, any written texts were laboriously copied by hand, usually by members of the clergy or via woodblock prints, and mainly in Latin, a language neither spoken nor read by commoners. It was incredibly expensive to own a book and pretty much useless to lower classes, which meant that literacy outside of the elites was pretty rare. And while printing has existed in Korea since the 13th century and during the Chinese Song dynasty, historians generally concur that the Asian and European variants occurred independently of each other. Now, why are we talking about books? I thought this podcast was about fashion. Well, research has linked early childhood literacy to intellectual outcomes. A 2014 study in the Society for Research in Child Development journal used over 1,800 identical twins living in the same home environments and tracked their literacy and intellectual outcomes over a period of 9 years, and found strong early reading predicts higher cognitive success. But before I elaborate on what that means for our discussion, I do want to take a moment to note that this evidence holds true for societies that privilege literacy. I was actually listening to the Gone Medieval podcast, and Dr. Eleanor Janaga brought up this point. Cultures that are based in oral tradition or symbolic imagery are no less intelligent. While many indigenous American cultures are easy examples of this, I want to take a less typical example that was brought up by Dr. Janaga. Vikings. They thought they would be a good one to discuss because they are in the same region as everything else we're discussing right now and are an example of this within the European cultures. While we have a plethora of fantastical interpretations of Vikings, in reality, we know pretty little about them because they use symbolic rune carving and mainly an oral tradition. I was literally listening to this episode at the gym last night, and I had to pull up my script on my phone to add this note because I really thought it contextualizes this point. Shout out to both Matt Lewis and Eleanor Janaga from the Gone Medieval podcast for discussing my favorite period in history in a very entertaining way, and always bringing me some new and useful information for my own research. Now, both early modern and modern society do privilege literacy. It's literally proof that you can afford to sit around and learn rather than laboring in the field to provide for yourself. If we consider medieval peasantry, illiteracy was a method for keeping people in place. Even if you were extraordinarily clever, if you didn't have anyone around you to teach you to read, you would be extremely limited in social mobility. One of the only ways to gain literacy was through religion. By joining the clergy, you might be taught to read and write, and be employed in copying out manuscripts or documenting histories. And while the life of an average clergyman might be better than that of the average peasant, many were still tasked with laboring on the land in order to provide food and income for their ecclesiastical community. So, no guarantees. This meant that the literate elites and the church had total control of all the information disseminated to the lower classes. But with the advent of the printing press, A big change was coming. At first, it was used to produce mini Bibles and small pamphlets, still targeted towards the already literate classes that were perhaps not wealthy enough to afford a handwritten illuminated manuscript. However, over the next half-century, the middling class I mentioned earlier was emerging. If the first generation moved to London and set up a bakery, they might have cause to learn their letters, their name, and keywords to do with running their business. And being in the city, they could probably find someone around them who would be able to help them do that. After seeing how much functional literacy advanced them with respect, improved finances, and control of their affairs, the first generation would, of course, set the second, their young child, to learn reading and writing with a tutor they could now afford. This generation is now able to manage their affairs completely independently, present themselves as educated, and improve the luck of their business, or invest in a mill in order to sell flour, as well as reduce the cost for their own needs. In just 2 generations, the former peasant baker, who relied on the church and their lord to tell them what to do, has now transformed into a well-to-do commoner, able to make their own opinions about all intellectual and spiritual matters provided to them in the form of textual communication. This reflected in their clothing, as they strove to do bigger and better business, presenting themselves as successful and, with the time, inspires trust in clients. Of course, this is an extremely simplified example, but it does illustrate my point. In the century that followed, this reshuffling of social strata was not going to go smoothly. At the same time, there was trouble in religious paradise. By the 1500s, the Catholic Church had become engorged beyond oblivion, from nobles donating money to have entire monasteries praying for them, to selling indulgences, which were basically paying for a shortened stay in purgatory. In essence, they were selling salvation by the pound. And a priest named Martin Luther was not into this. He wrote and published his 95 Theses in 1517, which by 1519 were prolific across the Holy Roman Empire. His critiques of the indulgences, as well as countless other things, were a direct challenge to the Church's authority, and provided an enemy for the less fortunate to blame. His work, as well as countless other critiques, led to the Reformation of Christianity, which in and of itself is a bit beyond the scope of this podcast, but it's important for us to understand the state of the Holy Roman Empire at this time. A period of unrest, reshuffling social strata, and religious reformation, which illustrates the context the fashion we are discussing lived in. So all this to say that no, trickle-down theory does not sufficiently explain trend flow. And trickle-down theory only holds true in a context that uses clothing as the chief signal of status in social strata with limited mobility. Now that we have all the historical context laid out, we'll be moving a bit faster. So an alternative theory is the social contagion theory. This theory proposes that in trend diffusion, the early adopters of the trend determine its success via their connections and circle of propagation. Essentially, the network of an adopter can make or break a fashion. This theory actually works really well to explain trend flow in modern society. With every single person having the potential to share information with millions, a trend can happen from the choice of a single key person that influences the masses. The aptly named influencers, quote, serve as opinion leaders, providing fashion information to consumers. This quote comes from a study that did a statistical analysis of runway images from the Korean 2022 fall-winter season compared with Korean fashion influencer outfits and the best-selling items among Korean fashion retailers. They found that top-selling items tend to reflect runway silhouettes, but items promoted by influencers show a statistically significant presence in the bestsellers regardless of runway presence. So clearly, social contagion theory seems like a decent fit to explain fashion flow today. But what about back in our tumultuous Renaissance? Well, with all the social limitations we discussed, it does align with those patterns. If the only people in a position to influence, with large enough circles of influence and motivation for others to copy them, and the ability to spread the word are the elites, social contagion theory can explain why people chose to copy back then. But what both theories are still missing is, why do people decide to try something new? And today, when the social stratification landscape is so different, what makes a person someone others want to copy? A recently proposed neutral model of change has strived to contextualize social contagion theory. This proposes that
It's all random.
Well, isn't that essentially that people start doing things randomly and people copy people randomly, and if there's enough copying, it happens to work out? This theory is appealing to science because of its simplicity, and we see randomness all around us, from allele selection and genetic evolution to radioactive decay. So why not social contagion? Well, my science brain wants to say that makes the most sense. Everything is random, everything is chaos. We have seen time and time again fashions resulting from social context and in turn affecting those contexts. Can it really all be random? Well, thankfully, a 2014 study has proposed an alternative model. First and foremost, it considers the fact that, quote, individuals express strong positive preferences for cultural traits and prefer to copy some models rather than others. They acknowledge that the status model does recognize this, but it's built on the idea that high-status people are inherently special.
You're perfect, you're beautiful, you look like Linda Evangelista, you're a model. Everything about you is perfect. Did you stone those tights? Oh, you're smiling.
While everyone else is boring, copycat, conformist, which, with our modern context, is pretty silly. So this study proposes that in fact there are two things happening, not just one. There is the preference for the trait, and the preference for the preference of the trait. Confused yet? It's called the preference model, and it's going to get more confusing. So perk your ears up. I'm going to try and explain this with an example. Since our last episode was about goth fashion, I'll go with that. If we have a person who has preference for the cultural trait of shock, aka evoking attention regardless of it being positive or negative, this person has trait P, preference. If we have another person that spontaneously tries drawing on their makeup in a striking black and white way, they have developed a trait T that the person with quality P has a preference for, since that makeup can evoke the cultural trait of shock. As the person with trait T, or the makeup, goes out into the world, and that network contains several people like our first person with trait P, they're more likely to adopt trait T. But what makes people have trait P, the preference? Well, if we look at a more recent example, let's talk about the IG modelification of the 2010s. The fashionable, curvy, BBL body shape propagated on Instagram and largely started by Kim Kardashian. Now, this body shape is more naturally occurring in Black women, a historically disenfranchised group. And through the early 2000s, when Kim was just starting her rise to fame, that body shape was looked down upon and perceived as unattractive. Both racism and fat phobia contributed to these attitudes, but as rap music was becoming more mainstream, curvy women were finding a new appreciation. Kim, who even before the modern crazy Kim body was still a curvy girl, was moving in circles and dating partners that had a preference for this physical body type trait. Kim had cultural trait P, preference for fame and perceived attractiveness. The physical trait of the slim, thick, curvaceous body type is trait T, that she also possessed and enhanced after seeing that trait T was means of achieving fame and perceived attractiveness in the circles she was moving in. So Kim was a person with both traits P and T. Her rise to fame and perceived attractiveness to the world of elite athletes and rappers, and the increased preference for the curvy physical body type from those sources meant that people who had preference P were more likely to copy trait T, the physical body type. The success of those people down the line was tied to the advent of social media and their ability to gain validation and continue propagating trait T of the physical body type. Now, in the 2 decades that followed, this trait has stuck around and become a body fashion that has maintained cultural relevance. If there weren't enough people with the preference trait, or if Kim never got that famous, this might have never become a trend. So then if we know what makes people pick up a trend, what makes them drop it? Well, this theory posits that as a trend propagates, all the P people pick up trait T. And what is left is a bunch of PT people who possess both the trait and the preference for it. It basically becomes like a microcosm of preference or an echo chamber. Just like the goths we discussed last episode, this preference community will continue for a time, but it will usually evolve. As more extreme makeup looks became more common even outside of the goth subculture, goth makeup was no longer a means to evoke the cultural trait of shock. Those who continue to have a preference for that cultural trait might move on to other styles that create shock, or they might lose their preference for that shock trait. Those who carried the trait but not the preference for shock may continue to evolve the trait, but it loses the former prevalence. Just like trad goth makeup is no longer the only or main or even common form of makeup for people who identify as goths today. And plenty of influencers are getting their BBLs reversed and their filler dissolved. Their preference for fame and positive attention on their physical appearance did not necessarily disappear, as the Kim K look is no longer the popular means to satisfy that preference. That trait is abandoned, no less by Kim herself. She's now a businesswoman and a creative. She desires her fame to stem from her achievements rather than her physical attributes. She has abandoned the preference trait P as well as the physical trait T. Somewhat. But again, why? While there might be some spontaneity, I'm sure the social climate contributes to this as well. In the early 2000s, most female cultural models were sexy and dumb. And not dumb as in stupid, but dumb as in mute. Silently accepting the misogyny that let them rise to fame as supermodels, Playboy bunnies, sexy TV show lifeguards, pop stars, and reality fodder. The social preference for these traits in women let women with those traits succeed. While the traits themselves have changed a bit, the context of sexual objectification still remains consistent and often presented in the media as aspirational. But in the decades that followed, activism, intelligence, authenticity, and business acumen became more valued. But perceived attractiveness still remains at the forefront. Not only do you have to be sexy, but it has to look effortless and artful, or you're asking to be objectified. You have to be a full-time girl boss, but also a full-time mom, never age, dress trendy, but don't try too hard, wear no makeup, and did I mention be sexy? And while doing all of that is slightly impossible, everyone wants to pretend that they have it all together, especially on social media. In our modern world, those qualities provide you with the most social capital. Of course, there's a different and similarly unattainable bundle of qualities for men. So of course, people like Kim and many other influencers present themselves as possessing all of these traits, propagating the continuation of this cycle, even if the preference for the trait P and the trait itself, T, have been abandoned. Well, here comes the bombshell. Everyone has a preference to belong, a preference for connection and community. As philosopher Adam Smith argued, fashion is rooted in sympathy. By imitating others, relatability is created. Not only mutual relatability of person to person, but also an association of emotion to the lifestyle that a specific fashion represents. While the goth and the Kim K wannabe have very different trait P preferences, they're still rooted in this preference for acceptance and belonging. Fashion is so integral to how we feel internally and socially, so it's no surprise that belonging is first after survival necessities on Maslow's hierarchy of needs. So if fashion is a mechanism for belonging, why does everyone hate it? Some classic reasons for this are, it's girly, and girly things are bad. I'm not even joking. If you thought fashion would escape punishment for Eve's original sin, you thought wrong. Not only is it denigrated for being, quote, linked with outward appearance and women, aka vanity, but it's also seen as a, quote, capitalist manipulation of the public. At least Nietzsche and Kant thought fashion was a force for vanity that drove forward modernity. So while they somewhat sniffed their noses at it, they acknowledged its widespread effects and cultural significance. But why is fashion even so linked with women, when for a long time it was mainly men preoccupied with fashion? Toga makes the Roman and all that. Well, remember that Reformation of the Church we were talking about? In its rejection of excess and perceived sinning of the Catholic Church, Protestants and Puritans were leaning into a much more strict version of Christianity. This included fashions, especially gendered fashion. In the 1550s, French theologian John Calvin, and leading Protestant reformer, was a proponent of the necessity that the wearer's garb should reflect the biological sex, and other writers of the period reinforced this. This growing delineation between masculine and feminine garments aligned with the explosion of exaggerated feminine structured silhouettes in women's fashion. In Shaping Femininity, Sarah A. Bendall says, quote, "Humans are to an extent the social creations of their clothes. If clothing can make the body into a person, then it can also influence notions of gender, as the body was the primary site where gender differences were discussed, debated, and policed during the early modern period." So in tandem with the hyper-feminized shape of the female silhouette, the male silhouette became extremely different from women's. Their medieval robes and tabards were replaced with short shirts, doublets, hose, and don't forget the codpiece. And while all of this fulfilled the church's delineation of gender, they weren't too pleased with the ornate gaudiness. In William Harrison's 1577 description of England, he lamented, quote, "Oh, how much cost is bestowed nowadays upon our bodies, and how little upon our souls. How many suits of apparel hath the one, and how little furniture hath the other? How long time is asked in decking up of the first, and how little space left wherein to feed the latter." Ironically, much of this was in fact a woman's fault. Queen Elizabeth I, an OG influencer who heralded a new age of both men's and women's fashion during her reign. So as her own fashion became more opulent and elaborate with a more exaggerated silhouette, so did that of her courtiers. For the pious, who kept their fashions more reserved, their wives' attire was still a way to boast their wealth, which employed rich materials dyed in somber blacks to demonstrate both their wealth and their devotion. But don't forget, at the time, black was one of the most expensive and hardest colors to maintain. We also have to remember the world at this point. This is not softcore religion time. People were incredibly religious, and they truly believed everything preached about women in the Bible, and were convinced that these things were a matter of salvation. And while Elizabeth was a very successful monarch, in large part due to her embracing of Protestantism, that still wasn't enough. Though she quelled a lot of unrest from her predecessor, Bloody Mary's reign, and she managed it through peaceful means, she was still a woman. And many radical Protestants were not satisfied with her moderate methods of cleansing English society of Catholicism. I would be unsurprised if the lack of Catholic bloodshed was painted as feminine weakness. And her subsequent propagation of gaudy styles did not make the church like her any better. I theorize that the Reformation's separation of gender through clothing and Elizabeth's reign largely contributed to the solidification of fashion as feminine and ungodly, making the art of adorning ourselves doubly tainted with Eve's original sin and the sin of vanity. So, what does this mean? Despite fashion's integral place in human society, it has long been disdained as a practice of folly and femininity. We collectively forget that fashion is not only a matter of clothing. It is the evolving manifestation of collective choice and has the power to both change and reflect the present collective experience. We downplay the value of fashion as a means of connection, social communication, and self-expression. But at the same time, we can't escape it. We literally can't live without it. We either bend it or are bent by it. Just like the food we eat, We have to wear clothes, name our children, furnish our homes, cut our hair, work, write, read, and speak. All of these things are subject to fashion, and I don't think that will ever change. The social contagion theory, through the perspective of the preference model, creates statistical results that match empirical evidence and account for the humanity of choice. But it still doesn't answer why we choose to copy someone. This is where the status theory gets to sneak back in a little. Just because the world we live in is no longer structured around a commoner elite dichotomy, that doesn't mean that status is eliminated. We signal status by trying to present as the top dog within the group we aspire to be in. From being able to coyly say, I actually made it myself within the fashion design world, to flexing your connections to artists through unreleased tracks in the music scene, or running errands on a weekday because you work from home. And with the thousands of sub-aesthetics that are exploding online, clothing is still a part of this, just not in the same way. We've all heard about quiet luxury, but even beyond that, it's the person wearing a light coat in -20 weather because they're driving. I might be wearing my $1,000 Canada Goose or Super Puff to keep my booty warm at the bus stop, but that person just never needs to. As interestingly confusing as it is to discuss this, it all comes down to showing the significance of the collective choice that is fashion. Fashion is all the things at the same time. So to the question at the very top of this episode, if fashion is about connection, why do we hate when people copy us? Well, we like to copy people we want to be like, and we like to be copied by people who are part of the community we want to be in. It's validating. But if a copier is in the out group, we hate it, don't want to be anything like them, so we change it. After all, that quote goes, imitation is the sincerest form of flattery that mediocrity can pay to greatness. Thank you so much for joining me on this episode of Read the Care Tag. If you enjoyed this episode, make sure to subscribe, and I would love to hear your thoughts in the comments. As always, the sources are linked in the description, and I'll see you in the next one.